Okay, good morning. Welcome to our Project Cornerstone training for our book that will be read in April after spring break. This is the training for the book, How Do I Stand in Your Shoes? And the wonderful thing about this is the Project Cornerstone team has really looked at this sort of an extension of this book. We've already started in February with our empathy garden. We spoke already a little bit about empathy and what that is. We've defined that for the students here in this school community. And then last month with our book for Ruby Bridges, we were certainly taking what we'd already learned about empathy and expanding that to connect to a real person and a real experience. And so hoping that the students were able to put themselves in that mind frame or that thought process or discussion included something about getting to understand someone else's experience and how that experience even today is impacting and affecting our experience as students and community members in the greater world in regards to racism and the importance for acceptance and understanding and continuing to teach all to be respectful of each other and their differences and to embrace those. So today's lesson and book is now a story we will be important to say to the kids, this is not a real person, this is a story about a character named Miranda, and the story I'll be reading in a little bit, but some of the things that we can do as conversation starters is after we've said hello, good morning, and all those things, it's important, I think, to connect our kids in the classrooms back to the empathy garden. And so we can say, can anybody tell me, or does anyone remember what the word empathy means? And hopefully someone in the class will remember what empathy means. And so it's an opportunity to remind them again, we're talking about understanding someone else's feelings. And to do that, it's important, again, to understand your own feelings. And so if you want to, this is a very poor prop, but you can make your own if you are very creative and have a flair for arts and crafts. If you want to make yourself a heart, or maybe you have an old heart or something laying around from Valentine's Day. Again, we're looking at, this is April's lesson, but you may have some things from February or March. So either way, in the classroom, you can start with this if you want, that you can have a picture of a heart, and it says on the heart, what I will read after, but what you can do is you have a red heart, and you can say, so let's pretend that this person is walking down the hall in class, and when they're walking down the hall at school, maybe they trip and fall, or maybe they drop something, and instead of someone helping them, maybe someone laughs at them and someone sort of makes fun of them. Oh, you dropped something. And so it's an opportunity to point out that for that person, every time someone teases them or laughs at them, or even just doesn't help them when their heart is hurting in some way, it leaves an impression. And so we can point out to them that this is why empathy is so important, because before you speak, think and be smart. It's hard to fix a wrinkled heart. And so we can just use this as a nice visual aid that even though hopefully most of our students here have learned what empathy is and they're using it every day, it only takes one person to say or do something that is not considering someone else's feelings or is hurtful, and their heart is wrinkled forevermore on some level. Everything does affect us, and so maybe that might be a little heavy to start with, but that's the point of our lesson today, is to teach us and remind us that things that happen to us do matter. Words can hurt, and so we're going to talk about that in this character, Miranda, in the story. The other thing that we can do, if you feel like, I don't want to crumple up a heart or make that, maybe I want to use that later in the lesson. I didn't bring in a big box of shoes today, but one of the other things you could do as a conversation starter, so this is where as a reader you can be flexible. You can choose to start with this and do shoes later, or you can choose to start with shoes and do this later in your lesson. So if you have at home some shoes, variety of sizes, variety of styles, bring in maybe 4 or 5 pairs of shoes. They can be your kids' shoes or your shoes. But if you can bring in, if you want to, a variety of shoes, so maybe bring in a nice pair of shoes that you might wear when you're going out for a nice evening, you know, some heels or something fancy. Maybe bring in some boots or some shoes that you would use out when you're working, or if you have some snow boots or something. Maybe you haven't used them much this winter here in California, but maybe a pair of tennis shoes, maybe a pair of sandals or flip-flops. If you have like an old, ratty, worn out pair of shoes, bring those in too. And so you can bring in a box of shoes and you could kind of like, you know, line them all up in front of the classroom, and so we've got all these shoes here, and you can just start the lesson with, you know, asking students, hey, everyone, look at all these shoes. I want you to take a minute and notice what the color they are, what they look like, what makes one pair of shoes different from the other. And then ask the class the very simple question of, what can you tell me about the person who might wear these shoes? And so we kind of open that up for discussion. Obviously, after we've done our rules and, you know, introduction of ourselves as readers, then we go into these sort of lesson points of a conversation starter. So that's a great opportunity for discussion, and hopefully students will share or say or give you some interesting feedback about that. If I were to do that here, I'm sure everyone there and those of you out at home, you know, might have some thoughts or perspectives on who or what the person is who might be wearing those boots or those heels or those tennis shoes or those sandals. And so we give the kids an opportunity to talk about that. And then it's important to follow that up with this notion that we actually don't know that much about the person who wears these shoes. And we might think or assume that the person who's wearing sandals is, you know, kicking back at the beach on vacation, relaxing, but we may not know what the real story is, and that they're wearing sandals for a completely different reason. In the same way, we could assume, oh, look at these beautiful high heel shoes. This person must just be going out for a fancy, wonderful dinner, and what a great thing. And it turns out that these are the shoes that they wear to work, and they're really having to walk a mile in downtown financial district in high heel shoes. If you've ever had to do that, you're not always feeling so comfortable or happy, and maybe you don't even like your job. I don't know. So the point is, and even with the shoes that are worn out, you know, it could be, oh, you know, what is this person? They've just been wearing these shoes. Have they been given these shoes from someone else because they weren't able to buy their own pair of shoes? Or have they just worn these shoes out and they don't want to move on to a new pair of shoes, and it's hard for them to change? I mean, you see where like the conversation can go really deep, really far. So after that conversation, then, you know, we bring back this notion of that's part of why we're reading this book, because we want to talk more about this idea of what does it mean not only to understand how or what makes us different in terms of, you know, even just our shoes, but how could I stand in someone else's shoes? It does require empathy. It does require, or we're encouraging you as students to think about, you know, what life might be like in someone else's shoes. And then this is an opportunity to tie it back to our book last month, some of us maybe last week, for Ruby Bridges, about, you know, what might it have been like, and you probably didn't do this last month because we were hoping that you'd save that to this month, that you could then talk about with your students, what would it have felt like to have been in Ruby Bridges' shoes, to walk into that school every day with all that was happening around her. And so we really want you to use this lesson to really just kind of connect all that they've already been learning or been exposed to, and to use that opportunity to then talk again, you know, even if, you know, if you have the shoes here, tell me, what are your thoughts, you know, what would it have felt like to wear Ruby's shoes, you know, not physically the shoes themselves, but this idea of walking in her footsteps and what that may have felt like to be a 6-year-old black girl walking into an all-white school in Louisiana in 1961. And so we want to give our kids this opportunity to start seeing and experiencing and understanding the feelings behind these experiences that they're being exposed to through these books and this lesson. So that is a really good one. Conversation starter, perhaps, like I said, you might want to start with something simple and then use this shoes to be your entire activity discussion. But we want them to be in this mindset of understanding that for today, we're going to be talking a lot about shoes, and it's not, hey, let's all, go to the store and buy some new shoes, but this notion of what it means or what it feels like to walk in someone else's shoes. And so in the interest of time and not asking too much of your patience, because we love technology, and yet in this moment in this room, technology doesn't always love us. So we'll be putting up with our on our website in the Project Cornerstone section a link to a video that we want you to show the students before you read the book, and it is called there's a couple of different videos, and so we'll put these up. The first, though, is it's called "Put Yourself in Someone Else's Shoes," and it's by an organization or something called Clear, K-L-E-E-R. So that'll be the first one, and so we kind of like you to show that before you read the book. And so if I were to hold up this device, and if I were to connect to the internet, and if we were able to see the video today, and maybe we'll try when we're off camera, but we certainly are encouraging you to try at some point between now and when you do your lesson. It's a great little video put together of it starts out with 2 adults sitting like at a bus stop or at a park, 2 different benches. One is sitting there dressed, head to toe, shirt, pants, shoes, and the other one is sitting there dressed head to toe, shirts, pants, but no shoes. And so then that's kind of the introduction to this video. And it's a really neat kind of artistic video about this notion of what we were talking about and trying to demonstrate with our sort of shoe samples in the classroom. So that's a great little video that we want you to show the kids.
Can we show that in the class?
Yes, you'll be able to show that one in the class. And then there's a second video that is, starts with like a little black and white chalkboard, and it's also entitled "Put Yourself in Someone Else's Shoes." And so both of these are just going to kind of reinforce this notion of empathy and looking at or appreciating someone else's experience. And I also just want to point out that a couple of the other videos that we've already shown in February, when you were in the classrooms for the Empathy Garden and we showed the Sesame Street clip about empathy or the other video about empathy, those videos are also tied to this book, and so we chose to use those in February to just introduce this whole idea of empathy so that when we got to this lesson we could sort of dive a little deeper with our shoes and walking in someone else's shoes, because in theory, hopefully, our students already have been taught and understand the notion of empathy, to understand and to acknowledge someone else's feelings. And so now we can take it one step further, so to speak, in walking in someone else's shoes. You might have caught that cheesy tie-in at this hour, not sure. Anyway, so that's why we're kind of doing that this way this month. So those are 2 videos.
The second one is before reading also?
I think it's good because they're both, they have nothing to do with our story in terms of the character in the story, but they do kind of set a nice stage, or also just, we're moving along the lesson in that way, so it connects things well. Okay, so then after we've done that, then and this outline that we have, you'll see that there's a lot of different things we can do here, but the main thing is we're going to want to focus on this notion of putting ourselves into someone else's experience. Okay, so I also just wanted to point out, we're going to show those 2 videos, and then we have this discussion, and this book is pretty long. It's pretty wordy. So I want us to show the videos, but I also want us to be mindful of the time, and so depending on how much time you have in your classroom, if you're a classroom where you have more like 30 minutes, then you may want to skip the videos for this month and just go into the shoe example, the discussion of the book, and the reading of the book. So you'll have to just kind of gauge your time as well, because obviously the book is the primary thing we should be doing in class. Okay, so I think I will go ahead and read our book, and we'll introduce the book, and we'll point out how do I stand in your shoes, and this is a story about empathy. Okay. I think it's also good to point out, even before we start the book, or even after the first page, Miranda Peabody was 6 years old and very smart. So this is an opportunity to point out as well, hey, remember last month we read about Ruby Bridges, and she was 6 years old, and she was very smart. And this character is different than Ruby, even just in how she looks on the page. Even though they're the same age, it's a good opportunity to point that out sometimes. That, when you're 6 years old, just like any other age, there's a variety of behaviors and personalities to get to know. Okay, so here we go. She could spell her name backwards and forwards. Miranda. Pretty cool. They've got Miranda's name is one of those names that you can have spelled backwards or forwards there on the page. Okay. She could whistle many catchy tunes. She could even stand on one foot, chew sugarless gum, and twirl her short brown hair all at the same time. She had a mom who was a high school health teacher and a dad who worked in a very large office building. They both thought Miranda was the best and told her so quite often. You're the best. Yes, Miranda was a very smart and talented person, but she had one problem. I hope you can see that. Officer. She couldn't understand any of the students in her class, and she had no patience with them. In fact, she often got very angry with her classmates and made fun of them. She even called them names. So every day at school, Miranda would remark to her teacher, Mrs. Klemp, that she just didn't understand anyone in her class, and asked her teacher why the other students weren't as smart and as talented as she. She couldn't understand why Thomas Kopowski couldn't sing the school song on key. Miranda called him crackle voice right to his face. She couldn't understand why Arlene Lee couldn't draw straight lines. Miranda told Arlene that her pictures were the worst ones she had ever seen. And she couldn't understand why Brian Peters couldn't even finish his homework on time. Miranda told him he was slow and that he better speed up if he wanted to be successful in school. In fact, she couldn't even understand why her teacher, Mrs. Klemp, would constantly tell her that she should stop losing her temper, making people feel sad and calling them names. Miss Klemp suggested that Miranda try to understand other people by standing in their shoes. Miranda wondered what standing in someone else's shoes meant, so she decided to ask her best friend, Patricia Greentree, if she knew. She didn't know what this meant either, and neither did Mrs. Dollyrimple, Miranda's favorite doll, who just looked at Miranda and smiled. When she asked her mother about standing in someone else's shoes, her mother began to explain the importance of wearing properly fitted shoes. When she asked her father, he began reading the latest History of Selling Shoes annual report. Miranda got nowhere and began to wonder if she would ever learn how to stand in someone else's shoes. Finally, she decided to experiment. She collected all the shoes she could carry from the closets in her house and piled them carefully on the floor of her room. She sorted them into pairs and began to stand in each one. She stood in her dad's shiny leather slippers, but they were so big that she almost fell flat on her face. She then stood in her mother's platform summer sandals, but they were so high that Miranda could hardly see the floor. When she tried to stand in her baby shoes, they would only fit on the tops of her toes. Miranda tried on each pair in her carefully sorted pile, but none of them felt comfortably. So Miranda decided to go next door and ask her neighbor, Mrs. Fishpond, how she could stand in someone else's shoes. Mrs. Fishpond was very kind and very wise and often gave Miranda very good advice. Mrs. Fishpond, Miranda asked, how can I stand in someone else's shoes? Very carefully, Mrs. Fishpond answered. But I did, said Miranda. I tried on every pair of shoes I could find in my house, and none would fit. Mrs. Fishpond smiled. To really stand in someone else's shoes, you must put yourself in that person's place. You must show them empathy. Empathy, thought Miranda. Now there's something else that I don't understand. To show empathy, Mrs. Fishpond continued, you must either think of a time when you felt the same way as another person, or you must pretend to be the person you are trying to understand. So Miranda closed her eyes and remembered a time when she lost her front teeth and couldn't whistle for several weeks. Then she imagined herself standing in Thomas Kopowski's new green sneakers with the big white star on the side, trying to sing the school song while everyone else moaned and held their ears. How embarrassed he must have felt, thought Miranda. She then remembered a time in art class when she couldn't draw a face, no matter how hard she tried. Then she tried to imagine herself standing in Arlene Lee's fancy pink tennis shoes, trying to draw enough straight lines to make a house. How frustrated and sad Arlene must have felt, Miranda thought. Then she thought of the time she was trying to understand her spelling homework while her father practiced his favorite song over and over again on the saxophone. She then imagined herself standing in Brian Peters' black boots trying to finish homework while his brothers ran around screaming. How sad and embarrassed he must have felt when he had no homework to turn in the next day. Miranda even imagined herself standing in Mrs. Klemp's high-heeled loafers, and how frustrating it must be to hear Miranda's name-calling and complaints about the other students. When she had imagined herself in the place of everyone in her class, Miranda thanked Mrs. Fishpond for her help and ran home to tell her parents what she learned about empathy. Both of her parents hugged Miranda and told her she really was the best shoe stander in all of Mountain Stream Elementary School, that is. When Miranda arrived at school the next day, she looked around at all of her classmates and remembered what it was really like to stand in their shoes. In fact, the more shoe standing she imagined, the more she finally understood what it meant to have empathy and how important it was to understand other people and to be kind to them. Having empathy was an important tool that Miranda knew she needed to use every day, everywhere she went, and with everyone she met. That night, Miranda had a wonderful dream that she was standing in the shoes of everyone in the whole world, and that she had empathy for them all. And that is the story of how to stand in your shoes. Okay. So as you can see, there's a lot to cover in this book. But it's a great story of redemption, I think, or at least of learning, again, about what empathy is. So obviously our students are going to have some thoughts, they're going to have some feelings, they're going to have some comments. So just like we do every lesson, we're going to give the students an opportunity to share with us. So we're going to ask them, what they thought about Miranda. What did she do well? What were some things that made it difficult for her with her classmates in the beginning of the story? And we're going to guide this conversation, hopefully, to really help students to tell us and share with us, how do you think the students felt in the beginning of the story when Miranda was saying all these things? And so it might even be a great opportunity to kind of go back in the book and say, how do you think Thomas Kopowski felt, or Arlene Lee felt, or Brian Peters felt? I love the names, they're very catchy. And so it's really important in our discussion of the book to use this opportunity to talk again about feelings, even just having the kids list a bunch of feelings. There's never ever in these discussions about feelings should we limit our students' understanding or our students' exploration of feelings by saying, if one student says sad, just moving on to the next question. There's always an opportunity for a lot of students to share all these different feeling words, because there are a lot of feeling words associated with each of those characters in this book, and usually in any situation with anyone. So use that opportunity to really give the kids a chance to share feelings. And then most importantly, was there anyone in this story who was an upstander? We want to connect this idea again. I was in a classroom last month and made the comment, is anyone an upstander? And bless their hearts, even though we've been covering these things, there was a kid, and I'm going to assume this is a brand new student who just transferred to the school. I was in a class that I don't usually teach in, but either way, they were like, what's an upstander? Right in the front row. Thank you so much for asking. Great. But there may be students who this is still a word that they don't know yet. So every opportunity we get to talk about that. And then at the end of our lesson, we always do the upstander pledge so we can remind them these are the things that make anyone an upstander. But we can talk about who would be an upstander in this story. And hopefully everyone will be able to say, because this is a name you're not going to forget, Mrs. Fishpond is an upstander in this story in just explaining to Miranda what empathy is. Not the only upstander, but clearly, we want to give kids that opportunity. We could also make the point or the connection that at the end of the story, when Miranda truly understands what empathy is and walking other shoes, now she too is an upstander because she now can stand up for others, and just by standing in someone else's shoes and trying to be and show empathy towards someone is being an upstander. So that's a good connection as well. There's also a great graphic here in our PowerPoint. And so I think what we will do is we will photocopy this, print it, or print it out for you so that we'll have some copies so that you can take this into the classroom and then put this under our smartboard projectors to project to students. And so you probably can't see it out there, so I'm just gonna read what it says. It's a cute little graphic because it has all these shoes, and so that's really we're talking about shoes this month, everyone. We're talking about shoes. So how do I stand in your shoes? Having empathy means listen without interrupting. Remember when you felt the same way. Imagine how you might feel. Ask what the other person is feeling. Show you care with words and actions. Be an upstander. And so this will be a nice thing to just have for students to kind of follow through with that. So now we've been talking a lot and in our lesson, and so then we would move to our classroom activity. Hopefully our videos, our book reading, our discussion, we still have time to do an activity. It can be a very quick activity. So I'm going to start with an activity that I think there's a couple different things. And so I think if you are teaching TK, kindergarten, first grade, you could bring in some paper and have students sort of trace their own shoe, or have one student, probably they'd need some help, but you can trace so that they have a footprint. And so then we can just, they have a footprint, and we can have them, each person have a footprint, and maybe the activity is to write or draw on there something that shows empathy, or something that shows or speaks or is an example of a feeling, any feeling word. Maybe we just want to keep it simple with feeling words, or how you could be a good friend, or what you may want to do or say to stand in someone else's shoes since you have this footprint, and then they can take that home. The other thing is that maybe you feel like, oh, this is a really cool activity and I want to do this tracing of the shoes in second grade, third grade, that's fine too. I do think if you do that and you have them each sort of trace a shoe, I think it would be important, maybe a piece of paper and it has, maybe a piece of paper and it's big enough that you could fold it in half. And well, maybe not. Maybe leave it like this. I'm thinking the size of kids' feet are different. So someone's foot might take up this whole page. So maybe if you're going to do this with the students, you could also have them trace like their foot on this side. And then you could ask them maybe, or encourage them to go and trace the shoe of someone else's feet. And then maybe it's an opportunity, in pairs to have them each share something that about them that they're going to do, or that you notice about them that is being a good friend or something, or even if it isn't like specific to the person, like I've seen them do this, you could have each of them say, because we're doing something with a classmate who on some level is a friend to us in our class, maybe we can, what is something that you are going to do to be kind to someone in this class, and then they would write on their footprint, and then the other person would write on their footprint something they're going to do to be kind to someone else in the class. Does everyone? Yeah. So that's a kind of a fun, simple thing to do with the younger kids. You could also, if we're looking at maybe third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, I think this is suited well to play the come to the line game, and I think we may have done this game at some point earlier in the year with another book, but if you didn't, or even if you did, this is an opportunity to play that game again. And so there's a great video clip, and this isn't to be shown to students, but I think I'm going to try to find this because it's in our PowerPoint, and so we'll probably put that up on the website too. There's a great video clip of this school that did what's called Challenge Day, and this was like, I think, a middle school or a high school. And so this isn't something to, share with your students necessarily, but if you're wanting to try to do this Come to the Line game with 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade students this month, I would really encourage you to watch this video. It's a nice inspirational sort of video about an entire school committing to Challenge Day, school-wide activities all day, speakers coming in, and then it culminates with the entire student body in the multi-purpose room all participating in this game. And so the Come to the Line game, it's really important in whatever format you're doing it in, and certainly in your classroom. You may not even have room in your classroom, and so maybe your teacher would be willing to go outside for a few minutes. Sometimes when you take things outside, you have to really review before you go outside. Here's the expectation when we go outside. There are other classes who are learning, and so we want to remain orderly and quiet and following directions. So you may not need to go outside. You can also do it in your classroom. A lot of times there's a common area where they might come for story time stuff. So you might be able to do that. 4th and 5th graders, I think we could still play this game in the classroom even though the desks are filling most of the room. If everyone's standing up at their desk and you just have them sort of come to the middle, I don't know, maybe some of those, maybe you have to go outside. But either way, the whole idea is that, so we're gonna play the Come to the Line game, and this is a quiet game, and this is not one where you'll be sharing anything with your mouths, with terms of words, but you might be sharing something about yourself in terms of your actions. And so I will give on the handouts we'll attach to this as well as on the website. There'll be a link to it. We'll make a list of like statements and encourage you to read those statements. And so as the facilitator of this game, it's sort of come to the line if this applies to you. And so remember, these are 4th and maybe 3rd and 4th and 5th grade students, and we'll probably have a short amount of time to do this activity. So we're not going to go really deep. We're not going to be like, come to the line if your parents are divorced. We're not going to start with something like that. That's pretty heavy. It might just be come to the line if you had breakfast today or something, so we'll pick a variety of statements that we think are appropriate for the class, and your students in your class best. So of those lists, you can choose maybe 5, 6, 10, depending what the time is. And so it's just this opportunity. You want to make sure you have time so that students have a chance to come to the line. Hopefully at some point they all come to the line, or it also might be something where in the classroom, I'm thinking of this 5th grade class I do, and so maybe we don't come to the line in terms of, it could be that we stand up or we sit down, and so that might be a way to save time, because going outside of the classroom, setting up an area, that might be beyond what we have time for. So standing up, sitting down is another example of coming to the line, or even walk to the back of the class, walk to the front of the class, walk to this side of the class, that side of the class. But remember, you have sometimes 30 students, and we want it to be a quiet activity, a meaningful activity. We don't want kids trying to race to one side of the class from the other. So the standing up, sitting down might actually work much better. And so we make sure we have time to say a few of these statements, and then we make sure we have a time that we say, okay, the game is over. How did that feel for you when you were a person who was standing up? How did that feel when you were a person that was sitting down when other people were standing up? Or if, like I said, if you've done this, how did it feel when you were crossing one side of the classroom to the other? Were there any times where you felt uncomfortable to stand up or to sit down or to walk across or this, that? And so we're not gonna want to, take a lot of time, tell me, how did it feel when I asked if everyone in this classroom had a divorce and you had to stand up, and people, we're not going to go into specifics, and we're not even probably going to do that question, but we want to give kids the opportunity to understand and to appreciate in that moment, similar to hopefully last month when you did the activity where we may have had students, this side of the class is going to get to do this side of the class is going to get to do that. I know in my classroom, some of the older kids, this was they got really into that, but we might not have even spent as much time as we could have with really helping to educate them on, well, how did it really feel because they were caught up in the excitement of this class is doing that and this class is doing that, even just as a, you know, a role-playing example. So this is the opportunity this month to kind of follow up on that, and you could even say, whether it's coming to the line or standing up, sitting down in this game, bringing it back to the last month, and, you know, because both experiences were opportunities for you as a student, as an individual in this classroom, to see or experience, or hopefully even just look at what someone else's experience is like compared to yours. Because that's really the goal here, is wanting the kids to understand someone else's experience and their feelings. And here's what I'm looking for. Okay, so that is pretty much the lesson for the month. We have already shown this 10 ways to build relationships, but this is also another handout that we can maybe even just pull up under the screen like we did with this one at some point. There's a lot of good stuff, and so I'm going to kind of leave it to you, depending on what you've done in your classrooms already this year, in terms of, you know, how you want to facilitate that classroom discussion. But basically the main goal of this lesson is this notion of understanding other people's feelings, other people's experiences. Here's the paper I was looking for. Thank you for your patience out there online. So just to remember that the goal of this lesson, when we're all said and done, is that we want students to notice and to name and to understand feelings or difficulties or experiences of others. And so this, how do I stand in your shoes, empathy, we're really bringing it home with everything they've already learned, so that we just come to this end of this lesson, hopefully students really having experienced on so many different levels this idea of how to understand how someone else is feeling, and how to notice that, to name that, to acknowledge that, and then to continue to go out, hopefully after these lessons and forevermore here at our school, to be kind to one another and to be you know, showing empathy. So I think that concludes our lesson. You would do your upstander pledge. You would then send them on their way.
Pass out the stickers.
Pass out your stickers, which we have forgotten to say sometimes in the past. So if for some reason you've forgotten to pass out stickers, then now's an opportunity, because this lesson is kind of part 3 of 3 lessons. So you can be sure to give out stickers from last month and this month together if you didn't last month. And so thank you for watching, and happy day today.